Welcome to Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, just to hear it out loud. Join Toby Malone and TJ Young, along with some special friends, as we puzzle our way through what we once thought was an unreadable book to produce a surprisingly listenable podcast. Welcome to a bonus episode of Wake, the podcast that says, should all acquaintance be forgot? It's probably somewhere in the fourth layer of Finnegan's Wake as we ring in the new year, fulfilling last year's New Year's resolution, a long-held bucket list item, reading James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake out loud just once. I'm your host, Toby Malone, joined once more by the man who knows exactly how to wring meaning out of any phrase, for better or for worse, TJ Young. Hi, TJ.
You just made me sound like one of those English professors who's like, but have you really looked at the meaning of the semicolon in this section?
You don't think you're one of those dramaturgy professors who does that?
No, my favorite thing to do is when students are like, what's this mean? I'm like, nothing. It's just a line that is said to get to the next part. It's fine.
And meaning has become this stumbling point for us throughout the entire process of this book, of desperately finding meaning. But I think if you approach what we're doing with that in mind, it means nothing, it's just a thing that is written down, stop thinking about it too much. Maybe all the purists would run out of things to talk about. I don't know, but we'll see. And this episode comes out right around New Year. Are you a New Year person or a New Year Grinch, TJ?
I'm a New Year person. I stay up, but I will say this. I rarely go out because I got something about being on the road with drunk folks after midnight, on purpose. It's just not me. So I will go to a New Year's party and usually leave about 11:15 so I can be home and drink my little champagne, get a little tipsy, and then fall asleep.
Nice.
But yeah, after midnight, no. Unless I'm staying the night there,
Yeah, it's not for me either. Having kids means that midnight is always a bit of a struggle. But we've instituted a new tradition now where we go to the movies at 10 o'clock on New Year's Eve, so that the movie lets out at 11:45. And it works out pretty well. So, and
that's
there's
cute.
there's no one there. We all go to the movie, and so that's fun. And so anyway, today is a non-reading episode of Wake. We're in no real hurry to get to the end of the book, since that means we'll have to finish the podcast. So we're going to take a diversion today to talk about a topic that's directly connected to the work that we're doing. This week we're joined by Zoe Patterson, a PhD candidate on the sacred grounds at Trinity College Dublin, who understands the significance of a cold read of Finnegan's Wake better than most. Zoe, welcome to Wake.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. Thank you guys for inviting me on the podcast.
Of course. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So, like you said, I'm a PhD candidate at Trinity, and my research is on Joycean reading groups and Joyce reader communities. So by Joyce reading groups, I basically mean Joyce book clubs. Those are book clubs that are devoted only to Joyce. Which makes them obviously stand out quite a bit from your standard book club where they're reading a different novel every month, that kind of thing. And I'm doing research on Joyce reading groups because there are just so many of them. So as you guys know, both Finnegan's Wake and also Ulysses are often described as these books that no one ever reads. But in practice, a lot of people do read them outside of literary academia. And one of the really popular ways in which to do that is to read both of those books with other people. So there are quite a few groups that read Ulysses together, that read Finnegan's Wake together. They all approach it in different ways. And if you look at reading groups that devote all of their time to one writer, there are some that devote their time to writers that are not Joyce, but Joyce has a particularly large amount of groups that focus solely on him. So I'm sort of looking at why that is, why Joyce's work lends itself so well to this sort of communal reading, and then I'm also looking at that alongside the kind of fan culture that exists around Joyce. So one of those things is the whole Bloomsday kind of industry, where I live in Dublin. We've got a lot of Joyce tourism, both, on June 16th itself, the day Ulysses takes place, but also throughout the year. There's just a lot of, stuff aimed at fans of Joyce who are visiting the country. In addition to that, there's also a lot of, Joyce social media groups as well, that operate in a really similar way to those Joyce reading groups I was talking about, where again, people, have created this sort of like almost kind of a pop culture version of Joyce. So I'm, looking at that sort of aspect of Joyce's reception, and within all that, how these types of reception are a response to, Joycean textual difficulty. Because again, as I'm sure you guys know, both Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses really have that reputation for difficulty. And these reading groups, these reader communities, these sort of fan cultures are one, type of response to that,
That's amazing.
reputation for difficulty. So, yeah.
So just take us back a few steps, and so where did you first encounter Joyce? Because you did your master's thesis on Joyce as well. Is that correct? So you're a Joycean going back a little ways, but you're also an American living in Ireland. So did you discover Joyce when you were a teenager? When you what was your first foray?
So technically, my first time reading Joyce was in high school. My English teacher, I think in junior year, had us read a few stories from Dubliners. I think we read The Dead, Araby, and Eveline, which are, those are the really popular ones for high school English classes. I really liked them at the time, but like they didn't really sort of stick as, I'm going to end up devoting my whole career to Joyce. But then in undergrad, I did my undergrad in the States. I read Portrait and I read Ulysses twice for two different classes, actually. And I got so into it. At the same time, I was just getting really into modernism as a literary movement in general. And Joyce seemed like, the peak of that, because he was just sort of everything I loved about modernist literature all bundled into one. So, in getting super into Joyce and wanting to, go to grad school and hopefully go into academia, I decided to do a master's at Trinity in Irish literature. So the entire degree was all on Irish literature, nothing else. And so from that, I really, sort of cemented the Joyce thing for myself, did my master's dissertation on Joyce, different topics, still reception studies. And yeah, so, I caught the Joyce bug, mostly in undergrad, and I just, haven't gotten rid of it since. So, yeah.
I'm wondering, you're talking about these reading groups, and whenever I mention to anyone that I'm reading Finnegan's Wake for a podcast, they look at me like, hey, I have three heads. But then there's also like a level of like assumed pretension. And we've talked about this on the podcast before. What are the type of people that you're finding are like forming these groups? Or, are they usually led by like one scholar? Or are they just like a group of people who happen to like white wine and Joyce? Like, what's the, yeah.
So it's really a mix, actually. So one sort of aspect of my research is that I'm really focusing on non-academic readers. And when I went into this project, I thought, I'm going to look at non-academic groups, because there are, university-based reading groups where it's just all scholars. But then I came to realize that a lot of those non-academic groups include scholars. So oftentimes these groups will be a mix of people who just want to read Joyce as a hobby, alongside people like myself. So a lot of groups are sort of a mix of those two, camps of readership. There are some that are, exclusively scholars, again, those like university-based groups, and then some that are exclusively non-academic readers, just because, less so that they don't want scholarly readers in there, and more so that they just don't haven't made that social connection with Joyce scholars. But yeah, a lot of them are a mix of the two. In terms of like other demographics, again, it varies, but a lot of the groups I see tend to be on the older end of the spectrum as well. I've noticed that a lot of non-academic readers will start later in life, because it's like Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake are kind of these things where it's like for a long time you're put off by reading them because they seem so intimidating, and then you get to a point where you're like, I really want to try this. It's like a bucket list kind of thing. And then also just in terms of like time, because like, people who are retired tend to have more time for these, large books if they're not, already focusing on literature as an aspect of their career. So they tend to lean older, but that's not a hard and fast rule. And I've seen some groups that tend to lean younger as well. And then another sort of big aspect of my research that I'm looking at is that these groups are worldwide. So obviously, in Ireland, there are quite a few, especially in Dublin, because you're kind of in the heart of all things Joyce. But there are actually quite a few outside of Ireland. There are loads in the United States. There's some in Canada as well. So, there's a big presence in North America. I've encountered a few groups in Australia, and there are a lot of groups also in the UK, and a lot of groups throughout continental Europe as well. So I don't know about the other parts of the world just because I haven't personally encountered groups from those parts of the world, but I, wouldn't be surprised if, their reach was even further than like what I'm aware of. So yeah, I think that's something that surprises people sometimes because when I tell people I'm working on this and, I'm doing it in Ireland, they assume that like all the groups I'm, writing about and speaking to are, in Ireland. And then I'm like, no, actually there are way more in the US than there are in Ireland. So it's, it's the kind of thing where there are certain trends in the demographics of groups, but honestly, a lot of them are really sort of like mixed in terms of who's there, that kind of thing. So
do you find there's a difference in the approach from group to group? I mean, obviously there are some that are probably doing what we're doing, which is rolling through without analysis, without discussion, just sort of to have read it. And then I'm sure there are others. I mean, we talked on the podcast a little while ago about that group in California who took 28 years to read Finnegan's Wake and finally got to the end. And obviously that 28 years was filled with discussion and fellowship and analysis, and that's fantastic. But I mean, so obviously there's different approaches that each group takes, and some groups would take weeks and months to read a chapter, whereas others would read that whole chapter in 2 hours and forget about meaning. Do you find that there's a general split between those two?
Yeah, so I'd say those are sort of the two. That's kind of the two overarching approaches that I've seen. Actually, the group that took 28 years to read the book, that is Jerry Fialko's reading group. I think I mentioned him before we started recording. But I've seen others like what you guys do, where they'll read the text for like an hour or so, just without stopping, and then chat about it. And then I've encountered a lot of groups too, where they'll just read a paragraph or two, and then they go back to the start and they kind of they comb through each word. And then some will take, sort of a middle ground approach where they'll read a few pages out loud before they go back and discuss. So I've seen, different sort of, lengths of text that groups take on. Obviously different like meeting lengths as well. I've seen some week groups that last an hour, some that last 3 hours per session. Also to the mode of reading aloud changes, because some groups, they'll take turns with the reading. I'm one of the groups that I know that, does what you guys do, where you read the text for like a long time before talking about it. They'll have a whole group of people and they'll do 1 page per person, where someone will read a page, it'll shift to the next person, and they just go in a circle for like an hour. Other groups have like a designated reader, generally a group leader, who's generally the one who's organized the group, who will just read, the passage they're going to read. I've noticed the ones where it's a designated reader, those tend to be the groups where they cover shorter amount of text during the meetings.
Understandable.
So, yeah. And then also discussion changes as well. Because, I've noticed some of the groups that'll do longer readings, they'll have a long discussion period. Others will have a very short one. With the ones that do the really short sections, they do tend to have longer discussion periods, as you might imagine. But, I'd say the major difference there is, the things they talk about in those sessions. because every reading group has their sort of, themes and ideas that they return to again and again. Because I'm sure, as you guys have noticed with Finnegan's Wake, there's so much to talk about there. It's kind of an encyclopedic. It's an encyclopedic text, and so groups tend to. One of the big differences between individual groups is, what parts of the encyclopedia they like to focus on.
Yeah, that leads me to a question about reading with aids or guides, right?
Mm-hmm.
What if you were to suggest, let's say we're starting another Finnegan's Wake reading group. We've already decided we're reading this book once and we're moving on, but still, let's say that we were. What would you say are the things to look for in these assistant guides for reading the book, or things that you would say, hey, maybe stay away from this aspect of it, or look for some, you know what I mean? Like some of the tips that you would give to someone.
Yeah, so I've actually spent a lot of time reading these sort of companion texts because I'm writing about them a lot in my thesis, more than I expected. But I'd say with Finnegan's Wake companions, the big things to look for are less so, like format and style, and more so what they're sort of saying to you about the process of reading Finnegan's Wake. So there are a few different kind of approaches to difficulty that these companion text writers will sort of offer to you as the reader. So some of them, they really sort of, egg on this idea that Finnegan's Wake is too hard to read, and they'll kind of be discouraging in their companion texts.
Oh, wow.
And I would say that is a red flag, because part of Finnegan's Wake is, trusting yourself with the book. And if the companion text you're reading doesn't trust you with the book, it's probably not going to be that helpful. So I'd say, companion texts that do sort of, say that, yes, you can, as a new reader, be trusted with this book. That's a good thing. Also, if they, present you with sort of strategies for reading, a good companion text will always tell you to read the Wake out loud, which, you guys know is the way to go, but not all new readers know that. And, they'll sort of texts that emphasize, the fact that you won't understand it every time. Texts that don't, really emphasize following a story. Because as you guys know, it's kind of impossible to follow a story in the Wake on first read. So, texts that like that sort of give you the strategies to deal with what you're about to be dealing with, and that prepare you for the fact that this is not going to be a normal book and you can't treat it like a normal book. So yeah, and I'd say too, with Wake companion texts, so what they tend to do, even the good ones, is they will give you a story. The stories differ between companion texts, and a good thing to keep in mind with them, which they won't always tell you to do this, because this is how that particular writer is reading Finnegan's Wake. But a good thing to always have in the back of your mind is that this might not be the story. The story they're giving me might not actually be the story that Joyce put in there, and that's okay. It might be 60% of it. It might be 40%. Like, it's. I think there's a big sort of Joyce companion text industry. There's a lot on Ulysses and a lot on Finnegan's Wake, and I think people read Ulysses ones, and with Ulysses, there's like a mostly clear story there, and that's communicated by the companion texts. And so people trust in this sort of summary thing that's going on. But then when you move to the Wake, you need to take all summary with a grain of salt. And I think the best companion texts are the ones that don't take that summary that seriously. They'll provide it because it's helpful to, give you sort of the confidence to read the Wake. But they won't say like, this is gospel, basically.
Yeah, I think those summaries that seem to imply that there's a definitive meaning are really troubling in some ways. I mean, so one of the things that we do at the end of every reading is that we'll go back to the Oxford World's Classic and use their summary, sort of their little précis that they have at the beginning of the edition, which at the beginning was quite useful because we thought, oh, okay, we're learning these characters' names and we're learning these relationships. But now I think probably 90% of the time they're almost getting in the way. And so we'll read and we'll get to the end and we've pulled certain kinds of things out. And then it will say, okay, now these are the four gentlemen and this is what's happening with Sean and Shem. And you go, oh, I didn't get any of that. And now what you're doing is you're making me second guess my experience because I went, oh, I enjoyed reading that, but now I think I missed it. I missed the point. And so we continue to do it because we've done it in every episode and we're going to continue to do it because it's just, we're completists. But I think if I was going to start again and, give me 6 months, I'll convince TJ to read it again. I don't know if we would use that same strategy. Because I think we came into it trepidatious about meaning, about going, well, it's too hard and we're not going to be able to read it. I mean, what's your relationship with Finnegan's Wake in particular? Is it one that you love or tolerate?
I'd say it's one I love at this point. So the first time I read Finnegan's Wake was, I forget exactly when it was, but it was after I had read all the other works, after I'd fallen in love with Ulysses, all of that. And the first time I read it, I read it in the way you're not supposed to read it, where I was, just on my own. I read it silently. I knew that, I wasn't going to be able to follow a story. I knew that. But, I like to tell people, after I read it that first time, oh, yeah, I've read Finnegan's Wake. My eyes saw every word that was printed there. Did they process every word? No. But yeah, so it's, I enjoyed it, but I was still very, on the Ulysses train. But I think in the research I've been doing, the Wake has almost been overtaking Ulysses as my favorite, favorite Joyce text, because just seeing what people do with it has been, amazing. And also just, in addition to researching reading groups, I've also participated in Joyce reading groups sort of outside of the research as well. And I came to the conclusion recently that reading Finnegan's Wake feels like writing, not reading, because it's with such an incomprehensible text, you're forced to create your own text in that moment. And it feels more like the writing process than the reading process to me. So yeah, I've come to a place where I love Finnegan's Wake because of that. But I think the first time I read it, I was like, this is cool and fun. Still like Ulysses better, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm finding that it's growing on me. But the reason it's growing on me is because I'm like, James Joyce is kind of filthy. Which, back to what Toby was saying with the Oxford World Classics summaries, I'm like, they're just too clean, because the content of Finnegan's Wake, I was like, it's laced with sex and scandal, and they gloss over it in the most scholarly way possible.
Yeah, they'll call it rather ribald, or
and you're like, no,
slightly incestuous.
Yeah, it's really kind of a testament to, the way Joyce's reception has changed, post the kind of, creation of the academic Joyce industry. Because when Joyce, I'm sure you guys probably know, but when Joyce published Ulysses, it was banned in the US for the better part of a decade, banned in the UK as well, for obscenity. And so, Joyce's initial reception as a writer was that he was a filthy writer. And so, on its first publication, The Wake didn't get, wasn't banned in the same way because no one could, parse out what was filthy about it. Everyone just kind of ignored it. And also too, the ban on Ulysses had been lifted by that point. So, there was a bit of a softening of that. But yeah, so that was a major part of his initial reception. And now it's something it's something we definitely talk about in Joycean academia. But like if you just ask like the average person who doesn't know that much about Joyce, they're not going to identify him as, you know, a filthy writer. They're going to identify him as just a difficult writer or an elitist writer. So that sort of sense of Joyce has really overtaken that initial reception of him as not a, you know, not an elitist writer, but like an obscene writer. So in that sort of, you know, again, even though like that aspect, you know, we do discuss it in sort of, you know, Joyce academia, but like when we're, you know, putting out materials for a general readership, it tends to fall by the wayside, because I think a lot of scholars know that like that's not what the general readership is concerned about. They're concerned about how difficult the text is.
Right. And obscenity today doesn't mean the same thing as obscenity in 1939.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's it's a really interesting the way that people are approaching this in so many different ways. I mean, and with those groups who are approaching the text with this intention of pulling certain kinds of things out. I mean, do you find that some of these groups are planning? I mean, I guess in your research, are you finding that a lot of these groups are planning to do what we're doing, which is read it once and then be done? Or I mean, I know that Sweeney's Pharmacy, they loop around, they just read and read and read every week, and they will forever. And whereas, I mean, so do you? I guess long way to ask a short question is that, do you find that that there's a finishing point for some of these groups? Do you find that some of these groups quit because it's too hard, or people just fade away? I mean, what's your stats on that?
Yeah, so I'd say there are a lot of groups that do just like intentionally loop around. You mentioned Sweeney's. They actually inspired my entire project. They were the first reading group I came into contact with. But there are others like them who, went into this with the intention of, looping around. But a lot of groups, I think, start out with the intention of not looping around and then do, because they realize that, the circular text sort of implies that you just keep reading it. Finnegan's Wake is kind of a text that you just sort of, I don't want to say get stuck in, but once you get into it, you just sort of stay there.
It is the book that never ends.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, but, like a lot of them, I think, don't go in with the intention of keeping it going, but they do anyway. I know a lot of groups, too, will start with Ulysses, and then they'll be like, oh, maybe we should try Finnegan's Wake, and they do, and then it becomes a big thing for them. I know a lot of groups, too, will start with either Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake, and then they'll decide to take a little break and read Dubliners together, read Portrait, or, so there's that as well. And then in terms of like people quitting, so I found that like groups as sort of, institutions do tend to like keep going, but individuals come and go. So, there's definitely far from perfect retention with a lot of these groups, and sometimes that's related to the text. People give up. Sometimes it's just other factors, life getting in the way. But I'd say like, I see a lot fewer like groups as whole entities dissolving, and more just groups changing. You also get a lot of people who join after groups have started. It happens with both Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, but I find it more interesting with Finnegan's Wake because that's, sort of the loop text where you can just get on at any stop. Whereas Ulysses, there is sort of a, start to finish there. But yeah, a lot of groups will have members who joined like a few years after the group started, when they're, already halfway through the wake, and it's just sort of fine. They, the pre-existing members in the group tend to, sort of kind of initiate them in and sort of give them, context on like what it is they're doing with the text. And yeah, so it's this sort of like, a lot of these reading groups are things that you can leave at any time, enter at any time. I've met readers who, will start with a group, they'll leave for like a year or two, and then they'll come back, and it's just, so yeah, so there is like, a lot of continuity with groups as wholes, but then individuals, it does tend to vary. I will say too, the California group that took 28 years to finish, they have started again. So even groups that take that long, there's still the intention. There's still the intention to go again.
Wow, I wish I could quit you.
I'm curious, and this is a fun game that Toby and I have been playing about, like what words from Finnegan's Wake are we going to have tattooed on our body. So, is there a phrase or a series of words or a passage that you find that you're so captivated with that you're like, I would have this tattooed on my body?
Oh, that's a good question, and I'm totally blanking. The one that I'm always reminded of, and it's kind of cheesy, but it is really nice, is the phrase "first we feel, then we fall." It's something. It's like a very nice, like kind of coherent nugget of text within Finnegan's Wake. There are these moments in Finnegan's Wake where it suddenly becomes like very clear and readable,
and it's
randomly.
Beautiful. And I get so mad because I'm like, and then you remind us that you could just write bars and be fine, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, no, but like that line, "the first we feel, then we fall," I forget where it is, but it has, to me, it has the same sort of vibe as the Ulysses line, the heaven tree of stars hung with humid night blue fruit, like just one of those like really, nice, like lovely Joyce lines.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, it's like that they what that is. They lived, they laughed, they loved, and left.
Oh yeah, I when I was listening to your guys' podcast earlier, you guys covered that phrase, and it's such a nice line, but also whenever I hear it, I'm like, oh, Joyce invented live, laugh, love.
He did.
He really did.
I'm still stuck on asphalt body and concrete soul. It's just so it's such a good line. I'm not going to spell it like he does because he puts K's in weird places, but I was like, that phrase is just so good.
Yeah, we committed ourselves to getting this Wake tattoos once we finished reading the Wake, and didn't realize. And we said it because we went, well, we're not going to finish this thing. We're gonna. We thought we were reading to ourselves. We thought, we started recording it to keep ourselves accountable, and that's the only reason, because we knew we wouldn't continue reading, because I knew that TJ would after a couple of weeks would be like, no, I got better things to do, I'm out. But if we were recording it, I knew that I'd be able to keep him on. But then now we're only 85 pages from the end, so we're going to be finished in like mid-January, so I guess we got to, and it's all on the record, so we got to
do it.
It's going to happen.
We got to do it.
Yeah, no, that accountability thing, that's such a common theme for reading groups as well. Like, I found that like for a lot of people, like that's what keeps them, reading the Wake or reading Ulysses, is, having this sort of, reading it with other people.
Yeah.
I always talk about reading the Wake with other people in terms of like, understanding the text itself. This sort of, collaborative reading leads to, everyone bringing their particular perspectives, knowledge and, interpretations together to, produce a coherent, not coherent necessarily, but produce a richer meaning than one would get on one's own.
Right.
But like beyond just the benefits for dealing with the text, it also just, brings people to the text in the first place.
And that's the really interesting thing. The thing that keeps coming up in my mind, and I'm not sure whether or not it's a good analogy, but the thing that keeps connecting for me with these Joyce reading groups and is with Bible study groups, and then also addiction anonymous groups. So you get addicts in a room sitting together, reading from a central text and passing the book down the line so that you can read whatever step you're on or whatever, and then you share. Bible study is probably a better connection, but I feel as though the community has to be a huge part of it. And that has to be, and I'm not necessarily saying that Joyce readers are like addicts, but
I don't know.
There's got to be something there.
Like, you're hitting the book for 28 years, and then you say, "I gotta go back." That sounds,
Yeah, that's like that'd be like if Andy Dufresne crawled back into prison after he escaped in the Shawshank Redemption, because he's like,
he's like, it was nice in there. I don't know.
Yeah, no, a lot of the readers I've spoken to, because as part of my research, I've interviewed a lot of people in reading groups, and a lot of the readers I've spoken to have like compared, reading Joyce in a group to Bible study, or to, some have described it to me as like going to church, especially those groups where they do, they cover a longer amount of text during the meeting. It's, they're just like listening and observing, and it's that sort of, that kind of vibe. But yeah, I think, in terms of the community being an important part of it, I think, what Joyce is asking us to do with Finnegan's Wake, also with Ulysses, but more so with Finnegan's Wake, is to completely abandon everything we know about reading, everything we've been taught about reading and about language. And one of the things we've been taught about reading is that it's this isolated thing. It's a thing you do on your own. It's a thing you do quietly. And, with Joyce, especially with Finnegan's Wake, you can't really do that. If you, speaking from my own experience of, reading Finnegan's Wake on my own quietly, like, I got something out of it, but gotten much more reading it with other people aloud and collaboratively. And I think some of it with Finnegan's Wake has to do with how Joyce repositions us in our relationship with language. So I think, the way we're taught to read, to follow story, to, prioritize plot-based comprehension over everything else, we're taught to sort of let language and let text be in charge of us. We're taught to follow instructions with them, do what we're told with them. And that, comes out in reading fiction, things like that. But also, has larger kind of societal implications. I think it's one of the reasons why, people are so susceptible to propaganda, why language is such a powerful, dangerous tool. And I think with Finnegan's Wake, Joyce is saying, I've created this text where it's impossible for you to do that. And so you're in charge. You're in charge of the language. You make the language do what you want it to do. So he sort of flipped the power dynamic between us and language. And I think in flipping that power dynamic, he gives people a voice as readers. And when you're given a voice as a reader, naturally you want to use that voice to communicate with others who've been given a voice by this text. So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that it works so well with other people, because it's put you in charge of what's going on rather than the book itself.
Yeah, there's two things that came to mind, and one is that I always make this analogy to my students about how when they learn something, it's actually really hard to unlearn it. And I always say, like, you can never not know how to read once you know how to read. You know what I mean? But then we open this book and then I'm like, do I know how to read? But I think that that's part of it, right? Like there's a community when you're in grade school and you're all learning to read together, right? You're all learning to understand. You're all learning new words together. That there's like this communal joy around that. And you actually, the other thing that you illuminated for me in saying that, because he throws away the idea of comprehension of plot or structure or character and all those other things, and it's like puts us in charge. It is strangely, and this is a weird leap, I know, strangely what I love about watching really strange anime, because they're unapologetic in the way that they are choosing to deliver the material, in a way that I'm like, as a Western writer, I'm like, I could learn a lot from that. And I'm picking that up from Finnegan's Wake as well. And really at the core of it, it's like, as long as you know what you're trying to do, like you said, when Joyce is like, you have control over the meaning and the way that it's interpreted. Like I've laid all this stuff out, but like you're in the driver's seat. Going in with that purpose allows you to do and be free in whatever way that you want to be. But it is that clarity of purpose that he has, right? That proves him to be a master writer, that it's not just, a lot of people will look at this and just say, it's a whole bunch of gobbledygook on a page, and be like, no, it's all extremely well thought out for the purpose of giving you the keys,
Yeah. Yeah, I like that you mentioned that, opening up Finnegan's Wake makes you feel like you don't know how to read anymore. Because I think, part of Finnegan's Wake is that he puts you back in the experience of learning how to read. So part of the, the reading Finnegan's Wake aloud is that, because of the way everything is spelled and the incorporation of, a million different languages, you have to sound things out like you do when you're learning to read. And so it brings us all back to that, that early experience of sounding words out. And like, not only does it make you, look at language more carefully than we would normally do, but it also just, signals to you that, you're learning to read in a new way. Something I always find very funny, we talked about the Sweeney's group before. So one sort of unique thing with them that I haven't seen with a lot of other groups is that they get a lot of drop-ins in their reading groups because they're sort of like a tourist destination. They'll have a lot of tourists who'll come in, and they'll come in for one reading group session. And I've noticed in sort of like, attending their reading groups as a participant, also heard about this, in my interviews with some of their readers, that a lot of times they'll get visitors who English isn't their first language, and they'll be convinced to come to a Wake reading group, and they won't want to read out loud because they're like, oh, my English is already not great, and this looks like really difficult. And whenever I'm there and I encounter people saying that, I'm like, you should try it anyway, because, we're on the same page. This is, yes, our levels of English are different, but like, this is hard for native English speakers as well. It's sort of the great equalizing text. Like, we're all, we're all on sort of a level playing field, with it. So, whenever people are like, oh, my English isn't, at this level, I'm like, it doesn't need to be. This is something completely different, Yeah.
I think about the translations of Finnegan's Wake, and I'm like, and how? Like, how? Yeah. But that's not for me to know.
Do you do any work on non-English speaking reading groups? Because I know that there are reading groups at Sweeney's where they do Italian and Portuguese and different kinds of languages on certain nights, and obviously Ulysses exists in plenty of translations. But do you find that there are groups who are reading it not in the original English?
Yeah, I've heard of a handful of groups that are doing that. I haven't included them in my work just because. There needs to be, there needs to be a certain limit to the scope of what I'm covering, because I've only got so much space in the thesis. But then also to my own expertise, I don't feel like I've got the language skills to be able to, thoughtfully write about a group that's reading in another language. So it's my own limitations as well. But I have, in terms of English groups that read in English, I've talked to readers who, again, like, English isn't their first language, and they're in the reading group, and like what that experience is like. So I've gotten those perspectives. But, while I'm aware of like the, translated reading groups, I haven't sort of included them in my study. So.
Totally fair. Yeah, I think I would look at Finnegan's Wake in Korean and be like, sure, great.
Yeah, I'm impressed that you're incorporating so much of Joyce as opposed to just sticking to a single text, because that would limit your scope obviously a lot more, or a single country. But yeah, I mean, it's really interesting how much it's pervaded. And I guess now there are reading groups on Zoom, and so do you find that? Have you been able to participate in any non-local reading groups in that way?
Yeah, so I've been able to, on like outside of the research, participate in some, reading groups that are based in places I've never been to. But in terms of like the research itself, so I've talked to a lot of people who are in Zoom reading groups, because, when COVID happened, a lot of in-person reading groups switched to Zoom, and then a lot of them stayed on Zoom even when restrictions lifted. This was usually because they either A, realized it was more convenient for the people who were in the group already, or B, which seems to be more common, when they went on Zoom, they'd have people from outside of their local area join. And then so once restrictions were lifted and they could meet in person again, they were actually like, hey, we have like 3 members who live on a different continent, so we kind of can't meet in person anymore. Right. And I've gotten really sort of like mixed responses from, people who were in-person groups that switched to Zoom. in terms of their experience with it. A lot of people love it, because like, again, A, it's more convenient. B, they, get to include people from elsewhere. And then also too, like when you're on Zoom, you have access, you can have like Fleet open in another tab. You can easily have all these resources open on your computer while you're, that you might not be able to have next to you in a reading group. But then I've also, like, on the flip side, encountered people who like weren't happy with the switch to Zoom, just because it does change sort of how conversation flows, because you can't read body language, things like that. It also, I've heard some people say that it changed sort of the like scope of participation. So one thing I, sort of notice is that some groups will have like a handful of people who will do a lot of the talking, and then other people who are there more listening.
Right.
And I've gotten the sense that with some groups, the vocal participation used to be more evenly spread between people, and now, it's become more concentrated on like a few, like, kind of key numbers.
Because TJ and I are both theatre people, and when the pandemic happened, we were quite heavily involved in Zoom theatre.
We did a lot of Zoom theatre.
Because there was no other option. Obviously, we were just stuck. And so, it became a really interesting thing where you have 25 little squares in the room, but only 4 of them have their cameras on. And then people you didn't even know if they were in the room. They would just, or they were almost certainly, we were trying to figure out ways of being sure that audience members weren't also on Facebook at the same time as they were in the show, but of course they were. Whereas you couldn't pull out your phone and look at your messages during a live performance if you were there in person. So I guess the difference between the physical space is the same way you can go to a church service on YouTube if you want to on a Sunday morning, but it's the physical space that makes the community a real thing. So yeah, it's a really interesting thing to feel is that some people do prefer the online, but it's probably a different kind of process.
Yeah. In all things considered, Toby and I have probably been in the same space a total of 10 times.
Yeah.
Over close to 6 years.
Yeah.
Which is kind of crazy to think about, but at the same time, like, the possibility that has opened up through digital communications and building a community. Like, we wouldn't have been able to meet you without technology like this. We wouldn't have been able to meet any of our other guests without this sort of technology. I think it's expanding the community. But I hear you when people are like, but I want that physical, tactile, like in the room sort of energy. Yeah.
And again, it's the accountability. If you show up in person, if you've got in the car and driven down to a place and gone into a church hall and sat with a bunch of other people and you've all got your copies of the text, the accountability of thinking, okay, I need to participate, I need to listen, I need to be engaged, I'm mentally here for the next hour or whatever it is very different to thinking, I'm going to flip my computer on after dinner and see, and if I'm get bored, then I'll
just walk away.
Walk away. Yeah, It's a very different kind of, and particularly since Joyce is hard, and that's the point. I think Joyce's because I think Joyce's progression through from his easy, he went from easiest to hardest as he wrote, and I think that was by design. I don't think. I think he thought, okay, tick, done that. What's next? And he developed as a writer and became more and more and more detailed in what he was doing, and which is something I really love about him, as opposed to him writing the hard one and then going back and writing the romantic comedy, and just to sort of as a palate cleanser, he upped his game every time. And so I think Joyce would say right away, yeah, it's hard, but a lot of things are hard. Shakespeare's hard when you first come across it, but but most of us have spent enough time with Shakespeare now that Shakespeare's easy. But there's nothing easy about Shakespeare. It's just repetition. So you got to have those repetitions for Joyce too. And like you say, you went from Dubliners and then finally got to the Wake, and now Wake is speaking to you most because you're mired in it. It's I feel the same way. I feel the same way about the Wake.
Yeah, there's with Joyce, it's one thing I think people don't get when they're hesitant about reading Ulysses or reading the Wake is that it's all about sort of building your own skills to handle it. They don't realize that it does get easier. And it gets, with the wake, it doesn't get easier in the sense that like, oh, you suddenly understand what's going on. It gets easier in that you just become comfortable with the discomfort.
Yes.
So I think, I think we're not like socialized to want to have that experience of like having to work for that to get easier kind of thing. It's not doesn't really line up well with, how we're taught to approach reading. So, yeah.
There's this when we first started, and I don't know if I've told you this, Toby. The thing that I've told Toby, I call this my weekly humbling. But the thing about it that really kind of got to me for the first couple sessions is I was like, I feel like I sound stupid, like I feel like this is if this is a person's first interaction with me, they're like, who is this unintelligible boob who's trying to struggle through this sacred text, right? I learned how to let that go, which I actually think has made me more malleable to the book and the text. But also, I think it's just a good lesson of remembering that hard things are hard. You can do hard things, and and it has no tie to like any personal intellect or anything like that, right? But yeah, at the beginning I was like, I feel like I sound dumb, which, as a teacher, I strive really hard not to sound dumb,
Well, and the interesting thing as we've been going, because we've had a lot of guests on, and the ones that have had the easiest time with reading Joyce have been the ones that have come in without any preconceptions that this is going to be hard. So both of my kids have read on, they're 12 and 15. Both of them, without any preparation, just came in and read it. And, it wasn't perfect, but they both were like, well, every day at school, I learn a new thing that I have to learn, and I'm given a thing and I'll just say the thing. And so they're not coming in going, but this is very difficult. I've been told this is difficult, and no one's ever read it, and I've been told in my guidebook that you're never going to understand this. And then you get there and you think, oh, they're right. And whereas, TJ's fiance came in and was just like, Joyce, okay, and then just like rolled through it. TJ's co-host on his other podcast, again, absolutely sort of no relationship with Joyce, very smart guy, but didn't come in thinking, oh, is this going to be difficult? And it's a really interesting thing that baggage can really weigh us down if we think that it's going to hurt us.
I mean, Dr. Seuss, if you think about it, to some degree, to someone is difficult. Who's it's and what's it's and weasels it. You're like, what? What are you saying? Right.
Yeah, that's like, when I talk about Joyce being difficult, I'll often, do air quotes, not to dismiss the feeling of like, Joyce being difficult to, people who are reading and who are having a hard time with them. But, to sort of acknowledge the fact that a lot of this difficulty is self-imposed. I say self-imposed, not more societally imposed.
Yeah.
Because you have this combination of, he's doing things that like we're not trained to expect from a book, from language, and then combine that with, decades of both pop culture and scholarship telling people that this is too difficult. So like a lot of it is sort of self-imposed in that way, that like we believe it's difficult, so it is difficult.
Yeah.
So I with the wake, I think it's I think it's cool that you guys are both theater guys, because I feel like reading the wake seems sort of similar to acting in that you have to of let go of the shame of being embarrassed. I feel like it feels similar in that way. You just have to sort of let go and just
absolutely. And we've had a lot of my former students, acting students, have been on the podcast as well, and have really treated it like it's an acting class where they're just, we'll get to play a character. And then there was one of our readers suddenly started giving voices to the characters, like really interesting accents, because he decided that this guy was like a Wild West cowboy, and sort of started doing this drawling Dallas accent. We're like, cool, sure, man, just go for it, and that was what helped him sort of connect to so it does feel very performative quite a lot. And I mean, voice acting was always something that I really enjoyed when I was an actor. And so this feels like a way of flexing that muscle a little bit. We have gotten better. I think TJ mentioned earlier on that, we were at the beginning, in the first couple of episodes, we were stumbling a little bit.
Toby's always been great. Don't let him lie to you.
Well, I'm always slightly embarrassed. Like when we talked before we started recording, you said you'd listened to the first 4 episodes, and I always cringe because I'm always like, the first 4, okay, we hadn't hit our stride yet. And then I look at the stats, and episode 0 and episode 1 have about 4 times as many listens as everything
happens
else.
Every time
because everyone listens and then goes like, these guys don't know what they're doing, and they switch off. Whereas now, if you listen to us now, we're not perfect, but we're better because we kind of used to what he's throwing at us. Mm-hmm. Even when we went through night lessons and got our way through all of the difficulties of book 2, we were able to sort of really go for it. And not once yet in Wake have either of us corrected the other or helped the other say a word. Not once. And that's that. And I want to keep that. And I always worry that a guest is going to like pipe in and say it's pronounced like this because that's not the point. The point is that we are discovering the meaning of the text together. And if someone stumbles or completely butchers a word or says it one way and it's meant to be another, I go, well, that other way that you've just said it, maybe that's a different meaning. That's a different kind of take on the word. That's so.
Yeah, I get in this weird flow state where I'm all like, I don't know what shape my mouth is making, and I'm just gonna go with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found with like pronunciation, when I'm reading it aloud, I will mispronounce words that I know. That I know how to pronounce.
Yes.
Because it's one thing when it's, a word he made up, something from another language, something like that, makes sense. But sometimes I'll mispronounce like the most basic English words that like I do know.
I do the same thing.
Yeah, because it just, you just sort of get into this state of, relearning how to read, how language works. And so you start making mistakes that like you would not normally make. And I say like mistakes with an asterisk with the Wake 2 because I feel like there are kind of no mistakes with Finnegan's Wake.
Right.
I like they're you could say there, but like it's that sort of text where there's like if you make a mistake, that's part of the whole thing. And yeah.
It is that releasing of your brain to say, I don't know what the first 7 words before this were, so I probably don't know what this word is. Then after you pass, you're like, I know exactly what that word is, but it's too late. So.
Well, and so often we just hit a word and we go, that was so fun to say that word. That word is crazy, and we'll circle it in our text, and then we'll come back and we're like, oh, look at this word. Imagine calling someone this phrase, or and that's the stuff that really keeps us going because, I mean, why not? That's the fun of it. So. Yeah, it's been good. It's been a good process. I mean, do you find that? So we're doing this podcast. There aren't many Finnegan's Wake podcasts out there for whatever reason. I think part of the reason is that it's not in the public domain everywhere right now, whereas it is in Canada, where I am. Do you find that reading groups, that a podcast like this would fit into your categories of a non-academic reading of Joyce?
Definitely would. I was actually not to put you guys on the spot, but when I was listening to you guys earlier, I was like, oh, I might write about them when I'm talking about reading because like listening to some of your discussions, I was like, oh, this really mirrors like the kind of discussion I hear in like like groups, and I'm like, oh, this could be a good like like reading about in a podcast where 2 people are reading it together, look at how their discussion functions just like it does in these more traditional like reading groups. Like the specific sort of connections you guys were making in the text, that kind of stuff. I was like, oh, this all sounds very familiar. So like I would count you guys like in that sort of reading group, under that reading group umbrella. So yeah.
Well, folks, you heard it here. Today is the day that Wake finally became academically legitimate. We may be cited in a forthcoming dissertation, and
I can finally put it in my tenure file.
Yeah, it's. I mean, do you find that are there other? Well, you mentioned there were other Joyce themed podcasts out there that you've spoken on. That have similar kinds of goals.
Yeah, so the two podcasts I mentioned before, one of them is Blooms and Barnacles. They're a Ulysses podcast. So, definitely a different approach just because Ulysses calls for a different approach.
Right.
But that's a podcast, going through the text, kind of like you guys are not reading the whole thing out loud like you guys are. But again, that sort of tracks with Ulysses and discussing it, that kind of thing. The other podcast I was talking about was less not Ulysses, Joyce specific podcast, more a podcast ran by someone who is, very much, I guess at this point, a somewhat well-known figure in the Wake world because, his reading group got a lot of press after taking 28 years to finish the book. So that was less a Joyce podcast and more a Joycean, who also runs a unrelated-ish podcast. We did talk about Joyce a lot, though, so kind of, but different than the other one that is distinctly a Joyce podcast.
Yeah, I think the thing that I found most astonishing about this whole process, and just to jump off what you were saying, is that the Joyce community is legion. The amount of people who are out there who love this guy.
We are many.
It is crazy to me that, I mean, we really thought that no one would listen to this, but just tagging Finnegan's Wake and James Joyce on the podcast means we have listeners and we have people who follow us on Instagram and who engage with us and who listen to each episode each week because they want some kind of outlet to be able to talk about Joyce. And so that's so gratifying and so incredible. I mean, when you first started this reading group dissertation, did you know it was so widespread, or was that the point? The fact that it was so widespread?
Yeah, so that was kind of the point, that it was so widespread. But I feel like I found out that it's more widespread than I even thought at the beginning. I think it's like it's such an interesting thing. Joyce being like the writer that everyone says no one reads, so ironically has this very much. This big sort of kind of international network of people who love him, and something I've been thinking about with like these reading groups, and why people join them. There's a lot of there's this idea that reading Ulysses or reading Finnegan's Wake is an accomplishment. It's like you get sort of a badge of honor, like, oh, I can say that I've done this, and that's impressive to people. And I think a lot of people who don't read Joyce see people who read Joyce and like assume that that's why they're doing it.
Right.
And I've kind of found that like a lot of people will go in with that intention and then realize that doesn't matter at all. That the importance of Joyce is the process, the practice of reading Joyce, rather than being able to say like, oh, I read Finnegan's Wake. It's like once you spend enough time with it and start to understand what it's like doing for you as a reader, as a person, it becomes less about oh, I can say I've read Joyce to reading Joyce is improving my experience in life just as a person.
I love that. I love that. I love the idea that the process of the read is way more important than the read. And so we sometimes would apologize feeling like, oh, well, like you said, all my eyes are passing over the words. Does that count as reading? We sometimes talk about it like going to an art gallery and looking at all the art, but not really taking it in. But the process for us has been this podcast of our Finnegan's Wake is this podcast where we've engage with it in so many different ways, and our reading of it is different to anyone else's reading of it because we're doing it in this way. But it's just another valid way of doing it. So thank you. I feel very validated right now.
Yes. Yeah.
So how far from the end are you? Are you in this process in the dissertation?
Hopefully a year and a half. So PhDs in Ireland are generally 4 years, and I'm now halfway through year 3. So
excellent. Congratulations. That's a big achievement.
So close.
Yes, you'll get there. Just keep on. The greatest advice I ever got when I was in graduate school was from my doctoral supervisor, who said, don't get it right, get it written. That for me, I always thought about that. Don't perfect it, just get the damn thing written. And so just keep chugging and keep doing amazing things. I think it sounds like such a fun topic to be able to engage with all these different kinds of approaches to Joyce. So yes, so thank you so much for being here, Zoe. It's been really a pleasure having you here with us, and that is all the time we have this week for Wake. So we will return next week to continue with our reading as we amazingly near the end of this tome. I've been Toby Malone, joined as ever by TJ Young, and thanks once again to Zoe Patterson, the future Dr. Zoe Patterson, here with us, and we'll link to your socials in our show notes so that we can follow your adventures in Joyce world. So thanks again.
Can't wait to like that graduation photo.
So we'll see you next week, book club members. This has been Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, just to hear it out loud. If you've made it this far, thank you for your dedication. Join us next week for another segment of Finnegan's Wake and a chat about what we've found. Wake is a Moon Street Media podcast, engineered by TJ Young and Toby Malone. Our theme song is The Ballad of Perso Riley, arranged and performed by Meg Logue after James Joyce. Wake is recorded in Canada, where Finnegan's Wake is in the public domain. For community and bonus content, join us at our free Patreon at patreon.com/wakepod. If you have questions about Finnegan's Wake, don't ask us. We're just as confused as you are. See you next week.